Good afternoon from Manila, and a warm morning and evening to those joining from different time zones. Thank you for joining and welcome to the consultation on different financing modalities. This is the 20th and the last set of regional consultations during the phase 2 of safeguard policy and review update at ADB. My name is Gelson Garcia, your overall moderator. This consultation is with the government stakeholders in South Asia and Central and West Asia. About 120 stakeholders from 20 countries registered in today's session, where about 100 are from the government agencies, mostly from South Asia and Central Asia, and Central and West Asia, and we're also joined by stakeholders from the rest of Asia. Just in terms of data, you are adding to more than 3,200 stakeholders already. We have engaged since the start of phase 2 consultations in November 2021. This is a very important topic in the safeguard review process, as we will discuss the lessons learned from the challenges and good practices in the application of safeguard requirements for different types of financing modalities of projects supported by ADB and partners. We will also discuss the proposed issues for consideration in ADB's revised safeguard policy that deal with the sovereign and private sector lending and other financial services. A huge part of the consultation is an interactive discussion, and we have prepared a few framing questions to get your inputs. So before I call on our speakers, here's a few gentle meeting reminders. Please join from a quiet, distraction-free area. Turn off your microphone when you're not speaking. During Q&A, you may ask by typing in them in the chat or raising your hand. You will then be asked to unmute and turn on your camera so you can ask your questions live. Be careful, be respectful to everyone, and we will manage time to keep with our schedule. We provide IT support, so you may ask for support by typing on the chat box. As you're joining by Zoom, here's a few guidance when using important buttons. Simultaneous interpretation is available. We provide Hindi, Urdu, and Russian for this session for interpretation. We also ask that you use your proper name in Zoom for our documentation. You can change your name on Zoom by clicking the participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And on the right hand of your screen, look for your name. Click on the More button on the right side of your name. Click on the Rename button. Type in your name and agency, then click OK. If you wish to send a message, question, or feedback, click the chat button. If you wish to comment or raise a question live in the language you prefer, please click on the smile icon and then click on raise hand. To show your video, click on the video icon. We value diverse and informed feedback from a wide range of stakeholders like you. So let me restate the safeguards that ADB has put in place in order to have meaningful consultations. The policy review and update consultations provide opportunities for stakeholders to express your views and opinions on ADB's environmental and social safeguards in the most meaningful and safest manner possible. All stakeholders are encouraged to articulate their inputs and concerns during these consultation sessions. By joining these sessions, you are consenting to the video and audio recording of these consultations in their subsequent release. ADB will prepare consultation summaries and disclose them publicly. This will ensure the accuracy and transparency of proceedings. Stakeholders wishing to exclude themselves from such recordings are asked to contact the Safeguard Policy Review and Update Secretariat at safeguardsupdate@adb.org within 2 weeks of the session to share your exceptions and exclusions. The recordings and documentation will allow ADB to review, consider, and respond to, if necessary, any comments and inputs made. Background materials on the financing modalities consultation have been released in preparation for this session. Your feedback are welcome. This will not be used for the purposes of retaliation, abuse, or any kind of discrimination. And if you have any issues or concerns on the disclosure, recording, confidentiality, potential risks, abuse, or any kind of discrimination during the consultations, or you wish to exclude yourself from the recording of events, please contact us at the Secretariat. In this consultation, we have 2 hours and a half, and here's how we plan to maximize our consultation session. First, Mr. Bruce Dunn, the Director for Safeguards Division under the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department, or SDCC of the bank, will provide his welcome remarks, an update as well on where we have been on the phase 2 consultations, and also what's next. Ms. Zara Abbas, the Principal Environment Specialist of SDCC, begins the session 1 with an overview and findings of the analytical study on safeguards and different financing modalities. Now, to make sure that we register your immediate feedback, and before we move to another presentation, we will have the first moderated discussion that runs for 35 minutes, and Mr. Duncan Lang, the Senior Environment Specialist for SDCC, will moderate. We'll then have a 5-minute break, and then after 5 minutes, we will return with Mr. Felix Oku, the Senior Social Development Specialist of SDCC, to lead the session 2 with his presentation on the private sector operations. The second moderated discussion will follow, and Duncan Lang resumes his moderation role. We'll then have an event evaluation, very quick, 5 minutes, no more than 5 minutes. Then we will have a wrap by Mr. Bruce Dunn. So we have a very interesting topic indeed. So I will now give the floor to Director Bruce Dunn for his welcome remarks. Bruce.
Great, thank you very much, Gelson. And good day and welcome. Thank you so much to everyone for joining this session today, especially our colleagues from ADB member countries from South Asia and Central and West Asia. Really happy that you can give us your time today for this session. As you've heard from Gelson, today we're going to be focusing on an important topic, looking at the application of different financing modalities in the context of the safeguards. I know that many of you have joined other consultation sessions that we've had over the last year, where we've been spending time to look at different safeguard issues. And typically we've been focusing in on how we apply safeguards in the context of projects. Typically individual infrastructure projects, I think, has been the major focus. But today we're going to be taking a bit of a pivot, and we'll be looking at how do we apply the safeguards to different types of modalities. We have a whole range that ADB uses, from programmatic approaches, such as our sector loans and multi-tranche financing facilities. We also have policy-based lending, and we've provided a lot of support through that modality, as well as budget support, counter-cyclical financing support during the COVID-19 period. And we also work with financial intermediaries and a whole range of other types of financing modalities. So we're now thinking about, how do you adapt the safeguards and the safeguard requirements when we have financing through those other modalities? And that's very much going to be the focus of the presentations and the discussions today. But before we go into that detail, what I'd like to share with you, particularly for some of you that might not have the most recent updates, is to give you more information on the process for the policy update and how the consultations are going to be fitting into the finalization of the policy. So with that, let me just turn to a small number of slides that I'll run through. The first that you'll now see on the screen is around the approach and methodology. Now, again, many of you have been with us through quite a lot of consultations, so I'll run through this fairly briefly just to update you. We started in 2020, and that followed ADB's independent evaluation department, which had done a review of the safeguards and recommended that we should modernize and update the policy. We started with a background paper and a stakeholder engagement plan, and then we went into a series of analytical studies. And actually, the work on financing modalities is the last in a series of those studies. We're then now in a process to gather stakeholder feedback, and we've been working quite intensively on that over the last 12 months. We've had a series of online consultations on the products of the analytical studies, and we've also completed a series of 10 in-country consultations to get more detailed feedback from governments and from civil society. We're now, though, trying to bring all of that together into the drafting of the safeguard policy, and the team has been working very hard on that. We have early drafts of a new environmental and social policy for the ADB and a set of environmental and social standards, and I'll give you a little bit more information on that later on. But we're drafting, and we're expecting to have a first draft of that policy available for stakeholders before ADB's annual meeting this year. That's going to be held in the first week of May. So before that time, we're expecting to have a first draft of the policy available publicly. We'll then go to ADB's board for a discussion on the draft. We're expecting to do that in July this year. Then we will be going out to you and to other stakeholders for comments on the first draft. We're expecting to spend the time period from July through to the end of the year to undertake more missions to visit you in country and also to do further online consultations. You will then have the opportunity to actually review the draft. You'll have the full draft with you, and then to be able to provide more specific feedback to us. We'll then be going into the next stage, which is to seek ADB's board approval. We're expecting to do that in the first quarter of next year, by March 2024. And then we would commence the preparations for the rollout of the policy. That would involve preparation of more detailed guidance materials and capacity building. We're expecting to develop a fairly intensive training program for our own staff and a capacity development program for our member countries and clients. That all needs to be done before the policy then becomes effective, and we're expecting that to be not before the beginning of 2025. If we go to the next slide, you'll see here a list of all of the studies that we've completed so far. All of these are available online, as are the consultation summaries, and actually we do have video recordings of all the consultations available. And you'll see right down at the end of that list, number 20 is this consultation and the analytical study that we're discussing today, Safeguards in Different Financing Modalities. Then if we go to the next slide, I'll just share with you briefly how all of this is coming together. Now, we have a structure for the new policy, which we are trying to converge and harmonize with other multilateral financial institutions. And the structure of the policy is largely modeled on what you may be familiar with from the International Finance Corporation or the World Bank's Environmental and Social Framework. All of those tend to have a fairly similar structure for the policy. What we will have for ADB is firstly a vision statement, which will set out how the ADB environmental and social policy will support global goals, such as the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement on climate change. And then you come down to the second level in this diagram, where we will have the ADB environmental and social policy that will set out the overall policy objectives, the policy risk screening and categorization process, and the due diligence requirements for the ADB. That will then be complemented by a set of environmental and social standards. These are the standards that would be screened and assessed against for any projects. And we will also have special requirements for different financing modalities. You'll see that in the middle of the screen there at the second level down. So there will be the standards for the borrowers and clients, but those standards will also be influenced by what is the financing modality. And there will be some adaptation of the safeguard requirements depending on whether you have a project investment, a policy-based lending, financial intermediaries, and other types of modalities. Then the policy will be then supported by, for ADB, our operations manual and staff instructions, plus a whole range of guidance and training materials. So that's the overall structure. And so we'll be getting into some of the details today on then what you can expect in terms of the requirements for different financing modalities. So with that as background, I'll end this opening remarks. And again, thank you very much for joining. And I'll pass back to Gelson, who will then turn over to my colleagues for the further presentations. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce. I now give the floor to Ms. Zara Abbas to provide the first session presentation. Zara.
Thank you, Gelson, and thank you, Bruce. So good morning, everybody. I will, as Bruce just discussed, I'll be going through the financing modalities and the different safeguards requirements for them, but I will focus on how we're going to be looking at things or in the coming policy, the new one, and based on the experience that we've had with implementing these modalities. So can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So we undertook a study, and the study was basically a desk review of the different financing modalities that are used by ADB, and also the experiences that we've had in implementing these modalities, and also some the lessons that we gained through other evaluation reports that ADB's internal evaluation department undertook on different financing modalities. And generally, the overall experience of this was compiled together. And we also, to some extent, looked at what other of our other comparator MFIs, or multilateral financing agencies, are doing in this area in order to guide us for the next policy. Next slide, please. So ADB has various lending modalities and financing instruments that we use for implementing projects. And the ones that are you must be most familiar with are the project loan and also the policy-based loan or the program loan, sector loans, the multi-tranche financing facility, emergency assistance, and also financial intermediaries and corporate finance. So in my part of the presentation, I'm going to run through the ones that are most commonly used by our sovereign clients, by government clients, and the last one, which is financial intermediaries and corporate finance, will be covered by my colleague Felix Oku after me. So for these modalities, we have, as part of the safeguards policy, there is an appendix which is known as Appendix 4, and that provides the safeguards requirements for these different financing modalities. So in the next slides, I'll walk you through the different financing modalities, their overall the requirements, some of the requirements for safeguards over there, and also the issues that we faced and the policy direction. So next slide, please. So the first one is the sector loan. Now this slide has a lot of information on it, and these have been shared with you beforehand. So I'm not going to go into the description of what the safeguards requirements are. I'll just touch upon what this the modality is. So the sector loan modality that's basically applicable when ADB would be supporting the development of a sector and through multiple sub-projects in that sector. And what happens in these cases is that most of the projects are not known at the time that the loan is processed. So for that reason, a sample sub-project is selected, which is whose safeguards are assessed. So, and then in order to assess the future projects, a framework is prepared so that our borrowers can use that framework to follow the next steps in terms of how to address safeguards in the upcoming projects. So the study that we undertook helped us identify some issues that we should consider in the new policy, and I'll just touch upon them over here. So given the nature of sector loans, which have multiple sub-projects, which are often spread across large geographic areas, we see that now under the new policy, as you may recall, is from our previous presentations and previous consultations with you, we will now be following a risk-based approach. So given the risk-based approach, a risk classification that will be undertaken can then focus on the broader safeguards implications across the whole sector. And at the scoping stage, this can then provide better guidance to the borrower on selecting the correct and appropriate type of environmental and social assessment tool for that particular sector loan, such as if it's very broad spread, a strategic assessment could be used. If it's more focused in a certain area, then possibly cumulative assessment, a detailed cumulative assessment could be undertaken, or depending on the nature. So that the risk assessment there can be a good means of identifying the assessment. And also the longer time commitment of a sector loan can also be used to to implement programs to strengthen borrower capacity. So next slide, please. So here, this slide shows essentially the multi-tranche financing facility, and on this slide, you can see that there's a description of what this means, and what are the safeguards requirements, and also some of the issues that we will be looking at for consideration. So basically this is very similar to a sector loan, and but it's also a long-term loan. That's why it's called a facility, and it's spread over a period of 10 years. And it can have multiple sub-projects which can be financed through different tranches. Now, they don't necessarily have to be across one sector. They can be multi-sector. So that's a bit of a difference there. But what we saw also over here was that the long-term commitment of the MFF provides an incentive to address safeguards issues and risks over a longer period of time. And also, if there are any complex issues, any complex safeguards issues, such as any social or environmental problems or capacity issues or any other issues that arise, there's sufficient time to address them across the tranches. So that is something that can be exploited more under the new policy, or used better under the new policy, I must say. So the issues, what we noticed that apart from this are that the safeguards requirements for the MFF can be strengthened in the area of, again, risk classification. So, and it can be broadened to the scale of the entire loan instead of the individual tranche. So that is an approach that could be incorporated into the new policy. And then to develop, also to develop specific criteria for sector-specific risks. So this can, and in addition to this, then this can basically be used at the scoping stage to identify the correct assessment tool similar to the suggestion for the sector loan. And then also the broader sector or facility approach can also similarly assist for long-term capacity building across the life of the MFF. Next slide, please. This slide shows the policy-based lending. And the policy-based lending is a form of sovereign budget support for sovereign guarantee that supports policy reforms and development expenditure programs of a developing member country. And it can be used to provide also balance of payments assistance or counter-cyclical fiscal support. So in this modality, the policy actions that are identified are looked at carefully for any environmental or social implications that they may have. And then that assessment identifies if there needs to be any measures taken to address those, if those policy actions will have any far-reaching environmental and social impacts or risks. So the issues that we identified for consideration with regards to this modality is that the risk classification process, again, should be a good tool to identify the likely environmental and social risks at the level of policy. So specific criteria may be developed to identify the high level and contextual risks that could affect the risk classification of the overall investment. And then this can be used to identify or basically accurately identify the environmental and social risks and the policy of these policy actions. And then also the type of assessment for these risks. Next slide, please. This is the emergency assistance loan, and this also has on this slide we can see the description and the safeguards requirements. So this basically includes early recovery activities such as the rehabilitating critical infrastructure, and also meeting basic needs and restore economic, social governance activities after disasters or emergencies. And safeguards requirements for such assistance or for such loans is because of the time crunch there, because of an emergency situation, it's important to provide assistance quickly. Mostly in this case, what happens is that the detailed environmental assessment plans and resettlement plans cannot be prepared before board approval, but a framework is required. And that framework is then used to undertake the detailed assessments later before the project actually is started. So what the finding here is that what we need to be a little bit mindful of is that in this the speed that's required to address the emergency, this should not in any way compromise or sacrifice the quality of the safeguards outcomes. So, so this is for this purpose, the new policy should have adequate provisions and guidance to achieve compliance and basically strengthen supervision and monitoring of environment of these emergency assistance loans. Next slide, please. So this is the results-based financing, or is it results-based lending? And this is in this form of lending, this finances a share of a government's ongoing program, either at the national level or at the sub-national level. And it basically, the government systems and institutions are used for implementing and for risk management of this the funds, and the funds are of the project, and the funds are then linked, or the release of funds is linked to the achievements of results. So against the results that are identified. So for this lending modality, an assessment is undertaken of the borrower's safeguard systems, which would then be used. And if there are any gaps, then the gaps are identified and gap filling measures are recommended, which are then monitored during implementation. So what we saw that what we see that for this purpose of this the new policy, if this modality is used more, there will be a better opportunity to improve this the overall eligibility requirements. So at the moment, the policy, the RBL policy was recently approved in 2019 after a long pilot period. And when it was approved, there were some findings of the pilot period that were incorporated in the policy was fine-tuned. So it was already, it's already been just recently looked at. So one of the recommendations was that the processes to determine the eligibility of the activities and strengthening of safeguards assessment needs to be undertaken, which was then done by factoring in programmatic and contextual risks. So that was added to the eligibility criteria for RBLs. And the readiness, what we saw was that the readiness of our developing member countries for RBL or results-based lending implementation is still low, and considerable support is required to train on how the RBL modality is implemented, and also to undertake those assessments of the safeguard systems of the government, which would then be used for these programs. So as part of the new policy, this strengthening would be required, and in addition, there would also be a need to include stronger monitoring methods or monitoring mechanisms of these of the outcomes of the safeguard system assessment. Next slide, please. So now the technical assistance and project preparation, these are not lending modalities as such, but these are modalities that are used to assist our borrowers to prepare projects. So the technical assistance then this is a technical assistance grant. Then there are also technical assistance loans, which are the project readiness facility and the small expenditure financing facility that are recently started there. And these are used to go beyond the preparation of say feasibility studies for the project, and they look at how to or possibly preparing safeguards assessments for the projects also. So these are for these modalities or the technical assistances, these are not usually categorized or classified as they are mostly used for preparing projects. But if there's a pilot activity involved and there's some construction involved, then they are also classified or categorized, and then they need to be looked at from that side. So I think that brings me to the end of my part of the presentation. I'll hand it over back to Jelson. Thank you so much. And Jelson, thank you.
Thank you, Zara. The different financing modalities which you have described, such as the sector loans, multi-transparency facilities, policy-based lending, emergency assistance loan, results-based lending, and technical assistance, should be familiar to many of our participants from the government, especially those coming from the implementing agencies, executing agencies, and project management units, although it may be new to some who may still be absorbing the terms, but the way you describe them, the safeguards that are required under the current policy, and the issues that we'd like to hear feedback on from our consultation participants, we hope that we have provided them greater clarity to inform our moderated discussion. So I'd like to call Duncan Lang, the Senior Environment Officer of the SDCC, to start eliciting feedback. So Duncan?
Thank you very much, Jelson. So this is the first part of the moderated discussion, which will be really focusing more on the modalities that Zara just provided for you earlier on. We would welcome your feedback on those. What I will do is open the floor to anybody. If you want to raise your hand, please feel free to do so. We can also take comments in the chat box. It doesn't matter if you want to put them in your local language, that is absolutely fine. We will get those translated as well. I can read them out as well if you are feeling shy and you would prefer me to do it. So really, I can open the floor now. You're very welcome to jump in, and we would welcome your feedback. This is a really great opportunity to bring up questions you might have on, existing implementation challenges that you have under the policy as it stands. But we also would like to hear where you see from the work that we've done so far on, our direction of travel with the policy update and how we're looking to implement that in the next couple of years, and with these different financial modalities. So with that, I open the floor. Please, if you would like to join, put your hand up. You can come in and ask your question directly, or as I said, you can put it in the chat. I've got one or two questions lined up, so I can bring them in, but I prefer to hear from participants if you have anything to say. So the floor is open. Anybody feel free to jump in. Thank you. Well, while we wait, perhaps I can just start the conversation going with a question related to our policy and climate change. So we've had two questions that came in, actually the same question from two different people, from Sadaf Iqbal and Raza Rehman, asking whether we could include climate change issues in the safeguard policy. So perhaps I could turn over to Bruce. Would you be happy to answer that one? I think that's a good question, and it's something that we have been thinking about quite a bit. Bruce, would you like to jump in on that one first?
Thanks, Duncan. Yes, that sounds good. So yeah, thank you very much for those questions. Clearly, climate change is a huge challenge for the international community, and ADB is fully behind the efforts to support the Paris Agreement on climate change. We've committed actually to align all of our sovereign operations that support directly to our member countries by July 2023, and for the private sector, 85% of operations by July 2023, this year, and then the rest of the private sector by the same time next year. So we're gearing up for that. And we're also working to look at how safeguards and climate change can be more closely integrated. We already have some aspects of climate change in the current safeguard policy, particularly under the environment safeguards, under pollution prevention, where there are requirements for the assessment of greenhouse gas emissions, and then also to take measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions where technically and financially viable. We're reviewing this, and we're also looking to integrate climate change risks. And we see it's very important for us to integrate climate risks alongside other risks that we might be facing in the context of the project. Right now, we're expecting actually to have a climate change standard in the context of safeguards, but we're still working through those details. So I'll stop there, but of course, if there are other questions related to climate, we're happy to take any specific ones. Thank you. Back to you, Duncan.
Thanks, Bruce. So I see we have a good question in the chat box from Ali Sibtain from the Chief Risk Officer on PPP Support Facility. So I will read this out, and Ali, feel free to jump in if I've missed anything. So in terms of enhancing public-private partnerships programs of the SIND, government has two features. It has an umbrella structure with multiple PPP sub-projects, an ESMF and an ESMS for sub-projects may be needed. Okay, it has PPP projects which have transfer of risk as its core component. Preliminary design at feasibility stage, preliminary design-based documents need to follow important steps on land acquisition in terms of legislation, and need to be closely followed, and certain important steps completed at initial stage, detailed design at implementation stage. There's a need for strong PIU on the ground, key stakeholders in entire process, HR resources and training capacity, building issues, and many other main bottlenecks. Right, there's quite a lot here. So there's a 15% premium on determined price at local law. And ADB SPS calls for replacement cost. In practice, 15% on replacement costs being paid. This may not be desired. So maybe I'll start with that, because I think that's a good point to. So we have capacity issues, I think, with dealing with projects, and particularly relating to land acquisition. And then we also have issues related to the cost that is coming in at. And then I'll move into the other ones. So from our side, I don't know if we have Madhu on the call here today. If not, perhaps you can turn over to Bruce related to land acquisition side of things.
Duncan, can you hear me?
Go ahead, Bruce.
Sorry about that, Duncan. I just had a little bit of
Can you hear me?
sticky mute. So thank you very much for that comment, and for giving us some details about the type of challenges that you're facing with that PPP framework there in Pakistan. Let me pick up briefly on a couple of points related to capacity and stakeholder engagement, and then may actually be good to pass to Felix Okut on the resettlement issues and the replacement cost point. Firstly, I just want to say more broadly that we recognize the need to provide, more specific training for our partners. Now, if I understand correctly, the project that you're discussing, there's a framework where we're sort of treating it like a financial intermediary transaction. And so you have your own environmental and social management system. And it can sometimes be a challenge to then align that with the requirements of ADB, or sometimes you may have financing coming from other sources, such as, maybe you've got the IFC or the World Bank or other partners that might also be providing funding, or even commercial banks. So we're looking to see how we can provide more support at the early stage in the transactions, to look at supporting you with the environmental and social management systems enhancement or establishment if they're not already in place, and then providing ongoing support. We've also received a lot of feedback from our stakeholder clients that they would appreciate much more detailed guidance. And so, for example, on the involuntary settlement, what are the expectations for you in the context of the land acquisition process in Pakistan, and how to align that with the ADB requirements? I think that's a very detailed and technical issue, which we could actually collaborate on more and provide more specific guidance to you based on the sort of experiences and challenges. Anyway, so that's a more of a general comment, but let me pass to Felix, if you can comment a little bit more on the replacement cost issues.
Thank you very much, Bruce, and thanks for the question. I think just a little bit to add to what Bruce has just said. So the SPS principle, and this may be significantly different from the countries that you mentioned in the specific context of the project, but yes, replacement cost principle should be maintained regardless of the mechanics of finance. I look at the context that you provided here, looks quite a little bit complicated with an overarching units that has been set up with a lot of framework approach that has been adopted, ESMF, you've also mentioned ESMS, and then underneath that there is a PPP project, but regardless, the replacement principle should be maintained. That has to do with like for like or better, and that also includes transactional costs, and this is based upon the final design. Sometimes at the PPP stage, you know, it depends on what kind of PPP is being proposed, whether it's a build, operate, transfer, which more or less sometimes could look at a turnkey project, or whether there is a transaction advisory service being provided either by another entity or a bank which precedes the PPP. Then you have to look at the mechanisms of how to leverage the safeguards into the land acquisition process. Typically for such projects as well, you tend to have the sovereign, which the government providing the land acquisition element of the transaction, which sometimes could be problematic. And then you have the concessionaire who is coming in doing the private element of the work, also having limited leverage in promoting some of the principles within the SPS. But nonetheless, the replacement principle has been maintained, and that cuts across whether there is physical displacement or there is economic displacement. And this looks at various entitlements for various affected people within the involuntary resettlement space. Maybe I'll just end here, but if you have any specifics with regards to this project, or maybe as it pertains to India and Pakistan, as Bruce mentioned, we're happy to take it offline and have that bilateral discussion with you. Over to you, Duncan.
Thanks very much, Felix. There's one last part to the question from Ali there. It's just to do with prioritization of projects should be as per realistic timelines, considering the constraints faced to safeguard implementation. So prioritizing easier to execute projects. I think this is something that is a challenge, and it's something that ADB gets called out on, is, you know, going away from projects that are more challenging. So I don't know whether Felix or Bruce, you want to just have a response on that one quickly to finish off the questions from Ali. Over.
Thanks, Duncan. Yeah, I can reply to that one. I think this is really a critical issue for our whole environmental and social safeguards. The lack of alignment between the approval of project financing and then the implementation stage, say completion of detailed design, readiness for projects and civil works activities, and how that links in with the whole procurement process, often can lead to delays. What we'd like to work towards is actually having very clear and realistic timetables for project preparation and project implementation. We'd also like to have a clearer understanding of the issues that need to be managed, and we're proposing to have a framework to use environmental and social commitment plans that would allow us to have agreements and commitments with our clients on what needs to be done and when. And hopefully that should also allow a little bit more flexibility to sequence issues. But there will always be some, critical binding constraints. For example, we need to make sure that the land acquisition process and the full compensation is provided to affected people before we physically impact them. And so that means we have to have this very tight sequencing of the land acquisition process prior to the commencement of civil works. Otherwise, things get delayed. And sometimes we do see that the bidding process and contracting and expectations for civil works gets out of sync with the safeguards. And so we need to find some ways to get those more tightly linked. We're looking at how we can do that from our procurement side, but we need to work very closely, with many of you who are from implementing agencies on getting that scheduling and timetabling right. Thanks, Duncan. I'll pass back to you.
Thanks, Bruce. So Ali, if you've got any further questions, now's the time to jump in, or I'll move on to the next question we have lined up. Okay. Well, look, next I will turn to the question from Camillus. And this relates to MFFs. So since the MFF is more beneficial to DMCs in respect of safeguard requirements to be implemented in a phased manner, it may be extended from 10 years to 15 years. So that's a very good question. Also, comparison between sector and MFF may be well explained so that DMCs proposing the projects may make use at the conception stage. I think this is an extremely good question. I'm a fan of MFFs, and they're shown to be very good in terms of safeguard implementation. So, Bruce, do you want to tackle this one?
Sure, thanks, Duncan. Yeah, good question. We've actually seen quite a number of programs that do struggle to meet the complete implementation financial disbursements within the 10-year period. It is something, though, that's outside of safeguards because it's set up as an agreement between ADB and our board on the whole modality. It's a good recommendation to look at possibly extending that financing limit out to 15 years. It's something I can take back to my colleagues and raise for further consideration. But whatever the timetable is, of course, the project and program would need to be delivered in that framework. Your other point about sort of using sector-like modalities in the context of an MFF, multi-tranche financing facility, I think there's already a lot of similarities actually between those modalities. The main difference is the MFF sets out a long-term program with a financing envelope, and then there can actually be multiple sub-projects or one large project that's broken up into financing tranches. So there's some similar dimensions, and in both cases we use a framework approach to agree with the borrower and client on what needs to be delivered for safeguards and by when, and then that can be rolled out on a project-by-project basis. So there are actually quite a few similarities between the two. But if you had some more specific aspect that you're interested, or a suggestion in terms of how can those approaches or methodologies be aligned or enhanced better together, it'd be very interesting to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Camillus, if you've got any further follow-up, now's the time to jump in, or I'll move on to the next question. Okay, so the next question we have is from Shiva Dakal. In the case of non-registered or recognized land by national law in relation to Nepal, what ADB new policies secures to address these impacts? So Felix, perhaps I can turn to you for this one.
Yes, guilty as mentioned. Thanks. That's a very good question, Shiva. Look, for all the issues that we speak about the SPS or its inadequacy to address many issues, this is one issue I think that it's quite explicit on. There are different, whenever the involuntary resettlement policy is triggered, there are different categories of affected people. So the non-registered or recognized land by national law, there are it's two things that have been bundled together. I just want to unpack it and explain. The first one is non-registered land. So where a land has not been registered, and we know land titling processes in many countries are quite very different. But there are many ways that we use to validate ownership. Ownership that has evolved over customary ownership for a long period of time, or has been because of many years over the time. There are many ways of verifying ownership other than whether it's been duly registered in accordance with land tenure system within a jurisdiction. So that is recognized, that if someone owns a land that is not formally recognized or has not got formal land title, that doesn't mean that he's not recognized as someone who is entitled. Then in many, the other piece that you mentioned is when it's not recognized by law. And we do have a few instances where maybe certain lands may be deemed to be government land, or may be deemed to be some other piece land that has been acquired maybe many years for government use, and maybe some communities may want it back. So if you say it's not recognized, it means the government is not recognize them as due owners of the land. In many cases, we say the SPS policy says that involuntary settlement should be recognized as a project development outcome. So if you are developing a road project to promote economic activity within a community, I don't see how less we should make people worse off economically by acquiring that land for that project, and that's what it means. So that is what we call the do good aspect, where even there is no recognition of that ownership of that land, and government will do everything possible to make sure that at the end of the project, nobody is worse off than before project. I may end here, but it goes a bit more, Shiva, into even where you have some things we say, activities that are being undertaken, economic activities that are being undertaken on the land, which may not even be classified as legal or duly recognized by land, and even the policies to make some level of recognition for that. Okay, over to you, Duncan.
Thanks very much, Felix. That was a good comprehensive answer. So Shiva, did that answer your question fully? Hopefully it did. If not, feel free to jump in or raise your hand and we can provide some further feedback. If not, I will turn to the next question, which is from Takaharu Kojima from JICA. So Takaharu, you're interested to understand about our policy on preparation modalities. We mentioned that categorization will not be done for preparation modalities. Does that mean that you will not categorize feasibility studies supported by ADB, or are you misunderstanding? So I think we can give you some feedback on that about how we apply that. Perhaps I can turn to Zara on that one. Zara, over to you.
Yes, Takaharu-san. So what we actually do is, like, if for these project preparation modalities, if the project is identified and it's seen that this is a project which is a large, it's going to be a large category A project, then that preparation modality will prepare the environmental impact assessment for that project, or will undertake the safeguards due diligence documents under that. That will be financed through this. But if the preparation modality involves any type of pilot activities, any construction activities, anything which needs to be done in order to demonstrate a new technology or some, then in that case, it can be categorized, because if that particular pilot activity has any types of impacts. But what we actually do is we look at the categorization of the actual project that's going to follow. So the preparation the facility is financing for a project that will be in the future. So that is what we have to keep in mind. So so these new modalities, which are the PRF and the other one, those are used for preparing more detailed work, such as the safeguards documents as well. So I hope that's I clarified. If you want to come in and ask.
Yes, yes. Your answer was very clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's great. So we can then turn to the next question from Jahangir Alam from Dakar. So this is a very good question, actually, and I think one that I think is a good thing that we're looking at with the new policy update. So the question is about the language of safeguard monitoring reports that are disclosed. ADB discloses these EMRs or SMRs in English, but most of the affected people cannot understand and show their reactions. So will the new safeguard policy include the requirements of disclosing these reports in a local language. So perhaps I can turn back to Zara again, and if that's okay. Go ahead, Zara.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So the new safeguards policy will provide detailed requirements through the standards. So each standard, it provides requirements for our borrowers. Now, and it divides ADB's responsibilities versus our clients' or borrowers' responsibilities. And that is so ADB's responsibilities are written or detailed in the environment and social policy that that we have. Those are things that we have to, or we will have to undertake. So ADB is required to disclose the monitoring reports that are prepared by our borrower. Now, the borrower or the client can also disclose those in a language upon their own websites in a language that is understandable by the communities. But the reports that come to ADB, that's our responsibility to disclose them on our end. So that that is mostly in a language that is understandable, or an ADB language. But in case our Zara is on the call, maybe she could explain a little bit more, or Bruce, if you want to add something.
I don't think Zara's on. So Bruce, sorry.
Pass over to me. So yeah, I just want to add a couple of points. So as Sarah has said, we're taking an approach where we'll have a range of standards, and there will be one on stakeholder engagement, grievance redress mechanisms, and information disclosure. The reason why we're proposing to add that into the new policy framework is to give that more prominence. We already have requirements in the existing policy to ensure meaningful consultation with affected stakeholders, and to ensure that that pays attention to gender issues and to the needs of vulnerable groups. But what we've noticed is that, through a range of challenging projects and sometimes grievances and complaints that we've received, is that often doing the stakeholder engagement process, well, so that stakeholders are involved very early in the process and have an opportunity to provide their feedback, is a big challenge. And often some deficiencies around that typically do lead to delays in the project or complaints. So we've been discussing how do you strengthen that? And we think one of the key modalities is to ensure that projects have stakeholder engagement plans, and you prepare that based on the needs of the project. So not all projects need to have the same type of stakeholder engagement plan. It depends on how large the project is and the types of stakeholders to be affected. But we're recommending that projects prepare these plans and then they customize the stakeholder engagement process around that. As part of that, and getting back to your original question, I think you want to be able to disclose the relevant information down to local stakeholders in a form that they can understand, whether that's in local language or summary materials that basically take very technical information and put it into a form that they can understand. So this is something that we'd like to promote more. Thanks. I'll pass back, Duncan.
Thanks, Bruce. That was helpful clarification there. So maybe I can turn to the next question, unless there was any feedback on that point there. So we have the next question is from Alessia Chubutkina from Kazakhstan in Kazakhstan, relating to the question about whether the training presentation and other material will be provided. So when we're setting out the new policy, will that be done in advance, and how will we be able to help people implement the policy? So this is an extremely good question. well noted. And perhaps I can turn to Zara, who can give you some feedback about our plans in the next year, couple of years, about how we're going to roll out all the guidance and the policies, etc. So Zara, perhaps over to you.
Thank you, Lagan. Thank you, Alyssa. So yes, the policy at the moment we are still under the process of preparing, finalizing the policy and fine tuning it. Then we will take it to our board in 2 stages, and once the policy is approved by the board, then we will spend 1 year and rolling out the policy, which will include trainings for all of our development partners or developing member countries and the implementing agencies, ADB staff, and other people involved in implementing ADB projects. So that process will be that will start once the policy is approved, which is still about 6 to 8 months away. So and then to support that, we will also have detailed guidance materials produced for each standard. And in addition, there will also be technical notes where they're needed. So there will be a lot of policy support material and trainings which will take place. And yes, those will be available online as well. But first, the trainings will happen for our implementing agencies in a face-to-face or online modality. So thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I think just also worth noting, we'll also try and do these in a variety of different languages to help everybody get the best out of the training and the information that we deliver. So I'm conscious that we have another session, another segment coming up on the private sector modalities. So can I just offer one last round of questions? If anybody has any further questions, now is the time to add in, or we'll go on to the next sector. So actually, I see we've got 2. So Shazad, you put your hand up earlier on. Please feel free to jump in. So you've been waiting patiently. So Shazad, over to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. I have 3 questions. 2 are related to Ma'am Zahra Abbas and 1 in general. My first question is that on slide number 7, there was written that when various plans like resettlement plans, management plans, and environmental assessment reports are not prepared or will not be prepared, then the safeguard framework will be prepared following the 2009 SPS. My question is that while we are in a revision phase and the SPS 2009 is being revised, so why this is so to follow the 2009 SPS? Because in a span of time, we are all hopeful that it will be finalized. Then in future, why such environmental or social safeguard framework will be developed based on the 2009 SPS? It should be the latest version, 2023 or 24 or whatever. My first question is that. And then my second question is that in the next slide, that is results-based lending, RBL. I want to learn and I want some more clarity. Then is it a tool or something, or whatever it is, who normally initiates it, and when it is being initiated, and is it a need-based tool or what? I want some clarity if it is possible. And my general question is that while going through your website and different experiences, the LARP document, land acquisition resettlement plans, there are a lot of LARP documents uploaded on your website of different projects. But one common thing I have witnessed and I have experienced while reviewing any document, that all of them, or you can say most of them, are not on a standardized format. Like, although these are very categoric guideline or categoric table of content or structure is there in the SPS regarding the resettlement plan, but different consultants, different producers of the document do not comply with and you can easily witness and you can easily compare that each of the document have a different. Sometimes the TOC, the table of contents, are different. The subheads are different. It really makes the reviewers work a lot harder, and you cannot compare an apple with an apple. So many times this happens. So is there any possibility that the ADB propose or suggest some mechanism to make every consultant or the report writer and ensure them to comply with such a standard and do not go ahead of that? Thank you.
Thank you, Shazad, for the 3 questions there. Yep, I think we can respond to you there. I mean, I could almost tackle the last one because it's quite straightforward answer there, but I'll maybe as I'm moderator, I'll leave it to other colleagues. So perhaps I could turn over to Zara. Would you like to respond on the first one or the first 2, perhaps, since you were presented the slides? And Bruce, if you want to add anything additional, feel free to jump in. And then I think Felix can come in on the last point, if that's okay. So Zara, over to you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks, Duncan. So yes, Shahzad, thank you for your question. Sorry if I wasn't clear and confused you, but the reason for providing all those details on the slide was just to give an idea of what the present modality requirements are, so that we can see that as part of our study, what we did was we looked at what the current requirements are and how can we possibly improve them or change them or learn from however it was being implemented in the past to see if we can make any improvements. So those are the requirements of SPS 2009. And now under the new policy, we will be developing a new document which will cover the safeguards requirements for the new modalities under the new policy. But it may be the same to some extent, it may be different, but that would what we are suggesting there, which was on the slide, was that now we're going to be following a risk-based approach, which means we're going to assess the risk of a certain project. Then in that modality, that risk can be used, the risk assessment tool can identify what is the best type of assessment that can be undertaken to address those risks. So, and that was what we were trying to imply, but I hope that's clear now.
But who will be the key players in this exercise to conduct a risk assessment? Who will conduct that? Okay, and so at which stage can you, if you can add something on this?
Okay, so for this purpose, ADB together with the borrower is going to identify the risks of a project, and together the process will be undertaken to identify what is the classification of risk, and ADB will assign a risk classification. And based on that, the risk, then the scoping will be undertaken and will be identified what type of assessment would be the best tool to address those project level impacts and risks. So thank you. I'll pass over to Bruce now. Bruce will respond to the RBL question.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks very much, Shahzad. Some good questions. I just add on the last point about the MFFs and the use of frameworks, because that was the point you were raising. So that as an approach is likely to still be the approach under the new policy, because it makes sense. You're doing a wider programmatic approach, and you need some flexibility to implement a program based on the needs. And so what a framework intends to do is to identify, the roles and responsibilities and how the project will be prepared and implemented. And of course, that's linked to the risk categorization issue that Sarah was just mentioning. But that use of framework gives us some flexibility and sets out for you what's necessary. So we still think that's the right sort of tool. However, we have adapted some of the programs, MFFs, in that now, not exclusively, but I would say increasingly, we have these very large single projects that are being used through an MFF modality to break up tranches of financing, but it's essentially one project. If it's one project, there's not so much point in having a framework. You might as well do the environmental and social assessment process and then flow it out through the financing tranches. So that may be one difference with the new policy. Go on and now talk about RBL. But perhaps before getting into that detail, you asked about who initiates those. And I can certainly talk about that, but I wanted to ask for a little bit more clarification from your side. Let me maybe start. Of course, like any project that would come in for ADB financing, there would be an agreement between ADB and the country as part of our country partnership strategy on what projects are being proposed for the portfolio, and what would then be the appropriate modality for the financing. So results-based lending is one modality that we can use. Significant difference with results-based lending is you're not having the financing flow based on inputs, so activities to build, but on the actual results delivered. So say, for example, the results-based lending program is aiming to invest in water supply. We're not providing payments based on the inputs to construct water supplies, but we're providing financing based on the delivery of water to the end stakeholders. So it's a little bit of a different framework, and we rely more on the borrower's systems. And that's why the methodology is different. We do an assessment against the borrower or the client's systems to see if they're robust enough to deliver that program and to manage the safeguard risks. So we do more of sort of a screening of our policy versus your own requirements and see whether that's robust or whether there are any gaps that need to be filled in the context of the program. So the methodology is certainly a little bit different. But I wanted to pass back to you to see if you had some further questions or clarifications on that one.
Thank you so much, Bruce.
Great. So hopefully, if that's clear, your final question was on the LARP, the documents and the standardization issues. So I think my colleague Felix will come in and talk a bit more about that. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, Shahaz, I think it's a good observation you've made with what is purportedly inconsistent that you've observed among different resettlement plans across different projects. And as you noticed, when you look into our safeguard requirement 2, I think appendix 2, it gives you an outline of what a resettlement plan should be, right? That is a guide in terms of developing a resettlement plan. And inevitably, there are some elements of it that has to be consistent across different projects. For instance, if you go to executive summary, it has to be executive summary of the project, right? A project description has to pertain to that project. But what we do notice from operational point of view is that each project is unique and each project has its own project specifics with regards to land acquisition. So you will notice that the entire process of land acquisition and involuntary resettlement or resettling people, the key elements should be there. If any of those key elements are missing in terms of, for instance, it will start with the scope of land acquisition. I mean, who is being impacted? Involuntary settlement, is it physical displacement or economic displacement? It will touch on regulatory framework. In every lab that you should have, these are things that are consistent, but it will be also country specific. But then it goes into establish what the baseline is, entitlement, and then it takes you to the whole scheduling, affected people, compensation payment, up onto monitoring, and closing out the work. It should. Sometimes you may have one item bangled with the other, so then we focus more on substance rather than the form, but it's supposed to be a guide. And I agree with you, it's an observation. There are differences between projects because each project is project specific, but the key substance of each of these processes to address issues of involuntary settlement has to be present for us to deem it to be an SPS compliant lab. I hope that clarifies your question.
That's right. That's right. I agree with you. But I was just concerned about the content of the headings. I agree. The headings are always there. The heads are always there. Subheads, most of the time, subheads even are always there. But the content, which I agree, which is definitely subjective from one project to another project. But at least I have noticed that in some large documents, the heads and subheads are different. So that is the point I was concerned about. But yes, I agree with you overall that every project have different insight and different attributes. But I just shared my thought and experience so that if there is some way out to make it more aligned towards the standardized format or something. That's it.
I mean, a good point, and I think it's one that would take away. There will be areas where we can automate or standardize. I think we would do that to the utmost best by providing guidance, and then we will leave also room for projects to address specific issues project. So yeah, thanks on that.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shazad, for making this interactive. I'm very conscious of time because we need to move on to the next session. So Jahangir, if you're okay, we'll take your question in the next session, if that's okay. We will definitely tackle it then. And Michelle, I see your question there. Just to very quickly respond to you, that any existing projects will not follow the new policy. It will only be once the policy is approved and after 1 year, then projects will be implemented then after using the new policy. So when we've got a bedding in phase, and we can also go back to that in the next session as well, if I haven't got that 100% correct. But from my understanding, the existing projects will not be covered by that, by the new policy. So perhaps I can turn back to Gelson now, and then we can go to the next presentation and then go to the next moderated discussion after that. Thanks for the useful session just now.
Thank you.
Gelson, back to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Duncan. And to our participants, indeed, very good questions. Very substantive and well-structured comments. I note that there are more than 100 participants in the room, which is a good sign of wide interest in this topic. But for now, let's have a 5-minute break. Time for tea, coffee, or a glass of water. When we return, we'll hear another presentation from Felix, this time on safeguards in different financing modalities for ADB's private sector operations. So see you in 5 minutes. Welcome back. And we're back to our consultation, this time on to the presentation of the second presentation, which is about the private sector operations and safeguards and financing modalities. So Mr. Felix Oku, the Senior Social Development Specialist of ADB's Safeguards Division, will lead the session. So Felix, you now have the floor.
Thank you very much, Jelsi, and welcome all of you to this part, second part of the presentation. Try and keep it quite very snappy so we have enough time to have meaningful discussion. But this session, although it's titled Private Sector Operations, will cover three main financing modalities, two of which is dedicated to our private sector operations, and one is used bank-wide, which is our financial intermediation work. Can I have next slide, please? So the safeguard policy statement has been effective over a decade ago. Within that decade, the private sector arm of the bank business has evolved, has become innovative, and has adopted quite very new modes and mechanics of finance for both investments-based projects and providing debts, including guarantees as well. So you see there's this FIs work that is being used by banks and non-banks, and also that includes our private equity funds as well. I've also mentioned innovative mechanics of finance, which includes the capital market transactions, including bonds, but also financing that has been provided for short-term arrangements, such as the trade finance in many instances. Over that decade as well, many of ADB's borrowers and clients have indeed come to have an appreciation of the value addition of meeting the SPS requirement. So, whereas in the past, maybe corporate tends to see this as a barrier, they've welcomed and have really recognized the additionality that taking on the additional requirement from the SPS. Next slide, please. So I'll be looking at these three financing modalities. What I'll say is the traditional one has to do with the project finance, and it's used by our private sector colleagues, quite very similar to project loan, and in many cases as well is also deployed in PPP or public-private partnership that had been discussed extensively after the first call. What is a project finance? So it's just a structured way of financing for a specific either infrastructure or business process, where dedicated project company is formed. Most of the time, this dedicated project company may be called a special purpose vehicle, and the cash flow from that company is what is used to service the loan or the debt in many instances. In terms of our current arrangement of safeguards requirement, our safeguard requirement 1, 2, 3 applies if they're triggered, and if it's triggered, then the necessary risk assessment and management plans will have to be developed prior to board approval. Where maybe based upon the stage of entry into a transaction, especially from our private sector operations, it could be that the infrastructure or business activity may have already been commenced. In that case, then there is a need to audit what is actually existing prior to entry by ADB, and then whatever gaps are identified as a result of the audit, a time-bound corrective action plan may be set up. Where SR 1 to 3 requirements are, and it's a category environment, the 120-day disclosure would apply, I think, pretty much. What are some of the things I think needs to be considered to make this financing modality a bit more nimble, adaptive, and easily deployable to enable our private sector arm of business? We think if we take the environmental and social action plan or environmental and social commitment plan that has to leverage on commitment from clients to allow compliance of certain safeguards actions over time, and gives better allocation of resources within that time frame to address those issues. If we can leverage more on that going forward, that would be quite very beneficial. Next slide, please. This one is also used predominantly by a private sector operation, and predominantly is covered by general corporate finance. What definition general corporate finance is a debt that's provided to a corporate entity, I say with no defined, sub-projects in view, or it's not earmarked, as we say, for implementing specific sub-projects. So in those cases, then the audit look at the corporate entity in its own by looking at a more portfolio approach in terms of the assessment. And again, an audit to be done on the environmental and social management system for that corporate entity, because that is a safeguard instrument that it uses to address potential environmental and social impacts. And where gaps are identified again, then the time-bound corrective action plan will be developed to do that. Again, where maybe Cat 1, Cat A environmental concern, the disclosure requirement per SR 1-3 will apply. A fascia of the general corporate finance is a corporate finance, and that corporate finance, then the proceeds are earmarked for implementing specific sub-projects. So the same approach audit is done on the existing facilities, and then where gaps are found, corrective actions are then put in place. What are some of the key issues which we think should be considered as part of the SPS update? We think a much more broader corporate finance arrangement in terms of safeguards will be a better positioning than the current approach where we have a general corporate finance and then you have corporate finance as a subset of it. I think broader corporate finance arrangement where the safeguards arrangement for either debt or equity, regardless of the form of debt that is provided or equity that is provided to a corporate entity, would be a better approach in terms of packaging. This will also be amenable in that instance for much more maybe innovative financing mechanics that will be issued for now in the future, including like capital market transactions, as I've mentioned, the bond market. We've got green, social, blue kind of bonds that ADB had participated in, and ADB will leverage its unique position to ensure that borrowers, comply with international guidelines and standards with transactions on the capital market. So that will be a better approach than the current arrangement. That approach as well would enable monitoring and disclosure of information in a manner that doesn't compromise the corporate client's ability to be competitive on the market. Next slide, please. The next one looks at our financial intermediation arm of business, and this is done by both our private sector operations and our sovereign arm of business. So what do you see here? It's just to give you an overview of our portfolio. What we've done is done a bit of a analysis of the FI portfolio between the years of 2010 to 2021. And for those of you who are not aware, we've got two safeguard categories for FI. So we have FI treated as C, so it's noted as FIC. And then we've got FI. So where we've said FIC, it means that it can only finance projects that have environmental and social category C, as we do with project loan or with project finance. But where we've deemed the FI, it means that there is allowance for financing sub-projects or sub-loans that are of category A or B. Let me just put a caveat there up to this stage that portfolio is predominantly B. We've got just about 3 FIs that can take sub-project category B, and those ones have really been worked out. The client has been worked out to ensure that they've got that they've got adequate mechanism in place to address the potential risks that come with such categories of projects. So what you see there is the spread of the FI project. I think the sovereign arm, the non-sovereign, the private sector operation is taking the lead with over 70% of the portfolio, and that's quite absolutely right. And we've also tried to analyze the spread across the 3 safeguards categories. On environment, when you see sovereign arm risk portfolio is quite very low, and the same risk appetite or risk portfolio could be explained to be that of the private sector operations again, with a lot of it maybe leaning towards the category B. A lot of the projects that are financed under the FI, if I may put a caveat on it as well, has to do with a very small, medium enterprise style, with loan ticket sizes ranging from a couple of thousands to maybe tens of thousands, really. And so it's still predominantly quite very low risk. Next slide will show us the spread across the involuntary resettlement. So you can see again, sovereign against our private sector operations, the spread is quite, the trend is quite very similar as well. And then you see that also against the IP. Yeah, next slide. So our financial intermediary work follows the same, and we've mentioned the various mechanisms that we deploy the FI financing instrument. We do that with private equity funds, our trade supply chain financing program as well, but also we finance FI through loans, equity, debt, credit lines, and guarantees as well. And again, where we have FI treated as C, then there's no need to develop anything, but inevitably over 80% of all FIs do have some kind of proper due diligence, and ESMS is developed. And where there are gaps that are identified, these gaps are, addressed through a time-bound corrective action plan. What are some of the things that we think issues that need to be considered for the SPS update? I think guidance. I kind of overemphasize that. And I think the ID report also mentioned that, which you'll see in the next slide. We need guidance to provide clarity on responsibilities for our clients and borrowers, as well as ADB. We need guidance to explain how due diligence to be conducted on the client with its capacity and commitment to implement the ESMS. And we also need guidance on how to monitor and report on the performance on the ESMS. Disclosure, I think there needs to be more clarity and on both ADB side and the client side as to what needs to be disclosed. Client's competitiveness to do business should be a core part of that discussion without necessarily having to disclose issues that are commercial confidentiality of clients as in public. To avoid issues of overcrowding and headroom, this ADB always co-finances with other lenders, so they need to harmonize. It's also quite very paramount. And make sure we don't put up an FI standard that is, significantly or materially different from our comparator institutions. Next slide. So I've touched on a few of these issues, but it's listed here for your own reading. And those are some of the highlights. But overall, the portfolio in terms of FI from our private sector side, from the ID report, was deemed as good as or better than what was observed in the sovereign. So even within the ADB, there is a lot of learning and knowledge transfers that can be done between the two arms of business of ADB. But broadly, guidance is an issue. Guidance to provide clarity, guidance on disclosure, categorization, and the mode in which we do it. And then other bits that we'll have to do to strengthen the borrower's capacity as well has also been identified. What we did after this was to do a benchmark and see how, next slide, how we compare with our sister institutions. And without going into necessary details here, I think a few of the things that you see, ADB aligns broadly with our comparators. You see ADB, IFC with EBRD, IDB Invest, and then what I've noted there to be EDFI is the European-based development financing institution. So for those of you aware, PROPACO, DEG, BII, that used to be CDC, and the rest. In terms of assessment and approach to how we conduct due diligence, asset class approach is what is predominantly used, especially where debt is being provided to a corporate entity. But then where equity, then a portfolio approach. I think the only unique difference has to do with EDFI, but that approach is informed by specific European directives. Double intermediation is allowed, but additional controls are put in place. We also found we were quite significantly different when it comes to disclosure requirement. With ADB, regardless of whether it's a private sector operation, you have a mandatory 120 days disclosure for environment category A. Our comparators all stick to 60-day disclosure. And in some cases for category B, 30 days disclosure really. And the policies that inform those disclosure requirements are stay there. I think I'll keep it here snappy and revert back to Gelson so we could have maybe a bit more, we can leave some more time for question and answer time. Over to you, Gelson.
Thanks, Phil.
You're mute, Gelson.
All right, thanks. Sorry for that. Thanks, Felix. Very snappy indeed, and it's very instructive the way you describe the safeguards requirements and issues for the three major financing modalities for ADB's private sector operations. Three framing questions will be flashed soon. I think it's being flashed now to spark reactions and feedback from our participants there. And to hear their comments, I'd like to call Duncan again to moderate the Q&A. Duncan, back to you.
Thanks so much, Chelson, and thanks, Felix, for the insightful presentation there. So feeling rather guilty from the round one, I think it's, unless we've got hands raised immediately, perhaps I can turn to Jahangir Alam if you're still there. You had your hand raised last time round, but we didn't have time. So if you'd like to jump in, we would very much welcome your feedback. Apologies, I had to cut the session short last time.
Thank you, Don.
Please go ahead.
Are you getting me? My
yes,
question,
I can.
Yes, I have actually suffering from internet connection here. Off and on, it is going and coming. So with this short time, I can place my questions. I am a safeguard officer in Bangladesh, and I feel difficulties for fixing the baseline study, or especially for agriculture or irrigation projects. Main pollutants are the agrochemicals, and my difficulty is when I go to study fix the baseline condition, I find I can't find the standards of pesticides. The same question I asked in last year during this sort of one of the session we launched, and I don't know what's the result at this moment in the draft documents. Main problem is in case of pesticides, there is no standards in Bangladesh, and also I don't know what about but standards of limit, and what especially in water, in water limit of pesticide residues. If I don't know how can take the measurements, how can I take mitigation measures for this sort of pesticide residues? Is it clear to you all? Residual pesticides standard limits is absent in some member countries.
Jahangir, that I think I caught most of that. I will say out the question again for my colleagues, and then perhaps I can turn over to Zara and Bruce to respond on that. But essentially, you were asking about you work in projects where you're looking to collect baseline information, and you're worried about, and you work in agriculture and irrigation sector, and the use of pesticides is significant. And what you're concerned about is the levels at which these can be used, because in the water bodies around the area, these can have an impact on the water bodies, but the levels at which they're being used, is that sustainable or not? And I think these are very good questions. And also, I think you were saying as well, what are the mitigation measures that can be used to ensure that those are not significantly impacting? So, I mean, what I can say to you on this is maybe this modalities is not something that is specific to what we're talking about today, but I think we can give you some feedback on that. But I think this is something that we will be looking more in the future with good practice and guidance as well. And this is an emerging issue that we're very much aware of. I was leading on the ESS 3, and we've added in consideration of pollution from pesticides and fertilizers as well. It's something that we want to consider, but we have hopefully got some hooks in there to allow us to expand on that and do some guidance and good practice. So I'm supposed to be moderating, so perhaps I should turn over to Bruce to give you a little bit more to add on what I've said there. Bruce, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to briefly come into this one. Thanks very much for the question. We got into some of these topics when we had a consultation on the pollution prevention standard, which is where this is covered. And actually, our current safeguard policy segment does have some information on this, but I'll provide a little bit of background now. Firstly, I mean, you're right, there's no universal standards globally that are in place that cover all pesticides. And actually there is a growing and very diverse range of pesticides that are out there on the market, and new ones are being put out there all the time. You've got some coverage from international conventions like the Stockholm Convention, which covered the persistent organic pollutants. That focused on 12, but it's been expanded. You've also got some work that the FAO has done on this around good practice for the management of pesticides. There's guidance materials that's available online. And then you also find that different countries have their own standards for some pesticides. So, you know, it's not necessarily an easy job for people like yourself. I think, as Duncan has already mentioned, as we are now going to have a new standard for pollution prevention, we'll also have a guidance note. And I think we can, in the context of that guidance note, dig into a bit more information around the best available standards and guidance that can be used in this area. So that's all I'll say for now, but I think, you know, it may be welcome at another time to get into these sort of technical comments. Thank you.
Sorry, just finding the unmute. Thanks very much for that, Bruce. I think, you know, this is an emerging issue, and a lot of the work that's done at the moment relates to human health rather than environmental health. So I think that's something that I think is something that we want to grapple, that particularly with these new emerging pesticides and fertilizers as well, like neonicotinoids is one that is out there that very little is really there about. Right, so next question we have, which is from I think Malik, you had said you wanted to raise a question and then you've written it down, so perhaps I'll read that out and perhaps turn to Zara for that one as a response. So so Malik, you say, at the time of preparation of the project, sometime we have to prepare two separate assessment reports, one for country-based guidelines and another for ADB SPS 2009. Now we are updating the SPS 2009. Is it possible that one environmental assessment, either it is IE or EIA, is okay for both, I think, national and ADB as well? So I think Zara's done a lot of work on country safeguard systems. So this is slightly related to that, and also related to where we're going with the policy and the update. So Zara, do you want to jump in and respond to that question from Malik there?
Yeah, all right, thank you. Just can you hear me? I think it's okay, great. So thank you, Malik Perez. Nice to have you here today. So yeah, so to answer this question, actually, according to the SPS.
Thank you, madam. Thank you.
Okay, so according to the SPS 2009, and also which will also be the case in our new policy, is that we have to make sure that we are following the country systems as well. So our projects cannot be out of compliance with the national requirements. So that is the first thing. But then we also have to follow our requirements. So in cases, and when an environmental and social impact assessment is undertaken, we do look at those areas that are different from between ADB's policy requirements as well and the government's requirements. So what we and in order to for us to proceed, we do require that government clearance of any environmental clearances, and I think you are talking about environment. So environment clearances are required at the national level. So for that purpose, in most cases, there is harmonization, and projects that are classified or in the earlier policies, which were categorized as category A by ADB, were also in most cases category A in Pakistan. So the environmental and social impact assessment could be the same. The only difference would be that the timing is sometimes the requirement of submitting national clearance is probably earlier. So that was the could have been or was in the past was a bit of an issue. But generally what we want to do is to, as much as possible, harmonize, of course, with other MFIs with whom we've been working. So that's why this policy will have a risk-based approach, and the risk-based approach will classify what are the risks. So if a project is classified a high risk according to ADB, and according to the government, if it's still category A, then it's you wouldn't have any discrepancy. But I think the timing is mostly problematic, that the national approvals are sometimes required earlier. So but I think we can work around that in most cases, and we have in the past worked around them, that we have tried to make the document and approach the document in such a way that it meets both requirements. So it's possible to do that. Bruce, do you want to add something to explain a little bit more?
Thanks, Sarah. Only to say that this is an area that we'd like to simplify where possible. We know that you all have your regulatory requirements, you have to prepare your own documentation, and it does seem like a duplication of effort to then have a set of additional documents specifically for the ADB. And then sometimes you've got co-financiers, might be ADB and the World Bank or another financier, and if we're all asking you to prepare different documents, it's a huge piece of work and a lot of additional transaction costs. So we like to the extent possible, build off your own documentation. If there are some gaps, though, perhaps ADB has some additional requirements that are not in your own policy frameworks, there may be ways to deal with that by having some supplementary documentation. But we think on a case-by-case basis, we should work for some simplification and also promote a more common approach between different co-financiers, so that we can work with you and agree with the co-financier on a common approach to what standards are applied. That's some of the things we're thinking about now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So nice.
Thank you, Malik.
Thank you.
Any further questions?
No.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. Okay, so next, perhaps we can turn to Irfan Hashmi. Been waiting very kindly there. So Irfan, you have your hand up. Please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. So I'm representing a special purpose vehicle that was established as a part of a reform program for the public-private partnership modalities. And the discussions that we've had right now and the ones previously, I raised a similar question last time as well. I can't really see any specific pluggages for PPP modalities. I mean, in the presentation, you've mentioned several different financing options that the bank provides. And to be very honest, the PPPs could, fall into any of those categories. I mean, they're not a pure FI. So in our case, there's we've got a special purpose vehicle established, which is also managing a viability gap fund. But then it's not a loan to the private sector. It's like basically the ADB is financing a viability gap fund, which is also used to sort of make, unviable infrastructure projects to be more viable. And that is how we sort of, fund guarantees and, fund upfront equities, because that's what public-private partnership is. So I'm not really sure how, the project finance modalities that you're recommending to change in the new SPS, and even, other mechanisms such as maybe results-based lending or MFF So I'd really like to know how you plan to sort of streamline PPPs into the new SPS. And then there are also some suggestions, or I'd say, some lessons that we've learned since we've been in this program for the last 3-4 years. So number one is that, the 120 days requirement, so that is really constraining because, once the government tenders out a project to the private party, so they've got a few months wherein they have to, sort of set up the company, they have to fulfill some CPs. And after that, they're ready to sort of start construction. And, if they're ready and because of some delays in approvals from the ADB regarding the environmental, the studies, whether it's the LARP or the EIA studies. So, I mean, the concessionaire can, stand up and say that, we are registering a relief event. So, I mean, in terms of contingent liabilities and, in terms of those sort of commitments, the risk just increases as the project gets into the implementation phase. And then there's another thing which is regarding the complaint and dispute resolution mechanism that ADB has. I'm not really sure how streamlined it is into the SPS. You've got separate accountability mechanism that sort of runs it. But, these infrastructure projects are big ticket items. They're all over the media. They're used by, they're even used by the governments and political parties to sort of, showcase their achievements or, their performance when they're going for the elections. So, I mean, these sort of things really do, projects do sort of, are sort of susceptible for people with malintentions, and they sort of, register complaints. And once a complaint is registered, our experience is that the ADB sort of, although they're saying that they're acting partially and impartially and they're very neutral, but, the standard is that they are really behind the complainant. So, I mean, if you go after PPPs, we've got SPV, so they are also a private party. They could also complain that, you're stopping our project. So, I mean, I think there is some gap in the accountability mechanisms or maybe in the conflict resolution mechanisms that ADB has, which can sort of, which could probably be, plugged so that these sort of, risks arising from relief events and, force majeures and this and stuff like that can sort of be contained. And as I said before, there should be maybe a PPP specific policy with regards to environmental and social safeguards, because as I said, they're not really ideally, they're not falling into any of those financing mechanisms that the bank is operating. Neither are they a purely project finance project. They are an infrastructural finance project, but of course the government is a partner in that project. So, I mean, these are just my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irfan. That's some really good feedback there. It's nice to get, detailed feedback because that really helps us to build the policy and make it better. So I think best if I turn over to Mark, who leads our private sector team from a safeguards perspective, and he can give you some feedback about, how we operate on the private sector side and where your issues he may see they will be hopefully resolved with the new system. Mark, can I turn over to you initially?
Yeah, sure, Duncan. I'm not familiar with this project, so I'm not familiar with the specifics, but I think our approach to PPPs is we treat them as projects, and depending who we're working with, that'll depend on where we require the various components to be introduced. So yeah, we're not going to do anything particularly different in the new policy for PPPs, except for all the new improvements in process and what's the word I'm looking for, and the general sort of project structure. So in the briefings, you may have picked up that we're taking a much more risk-based approach, that we're using early scoping to more define the requirements and that'll help identify what resources are required where. And likewise, those will apply across all sorts of different financing structures, whether it's standard project finance or whether we're looking at equity investments some form of bridging loan, debentures, etc. Each of those requirements will have their safeguard requirements in the policy. So there's going to be nothing new for SPVs there, particularly for PPPs. I guess I hear I'm suffering from what I call the Netflix problem. About 7 o'clock in the evening, everyone in the village starts streaming their Netflix service, and my bandwidth goes down. So my apologies if it's not coming through clearly. The point I was trying to make was, well, we recognise that PPPs are an interesting and important project structure. We won't be introducing specific requirements just for PPPs. They will still be required to follow normal safeguard requirements. Okay, the 120-day rule, obviously in private sector, that's been a concern for us, and there is a lot of discussion underway on that, and I think there will be a new approach in the new policy, but that is still being negotiated. And there was a comment raised about complaints and the accountability mechanism, and I think my view on that is that for any project to try and avoid arriving at the accountability mechanism, and the best way to do that is to really make sure that we are implementing effectively all the environmental management requirements and social requirements that we've designed into the project. I would say the majority of projects that end up at the accountability mechanism are there because we failed to properly implement the project. It's not down to project design. Okay, just a few very quick points from me there. Let me pass over to Bruce to give you a little bit more detail. I think he might chip in on the accountability mechanism as well.
Thanks very much, Mike. Thank you, Irfan. So let me come in on 2 points there. I recognize for you with the PPP support facility that you've been working on, for ADB, we're treating the actual transaction with ADB financing as a financial intermediary loan, channeling money, which then you channel through to individual projects with the viability gap financing, which can then be dealt as PPP. So you've got a kind of combination of a financial intermediary loan for ADB and your own environmental and social management systems, but then, essentially a form of modified project financing. I think what we're trying to do with the new policy is not try and necessarily define all details for every different type of project-specific application, but have a framework of different tools and processes that can be applied. So most PPPs do come through as a specific project investment, and we can deal with them as such, but sometimes there are nuances. But happy to have further conversations on that one as well if you've got additional ideas. Coming now to your question on the accountability mechanism, Mark's answered some of this, but I wanted to tell you and share with everyone here that actually ADB is now launching a review of the accountability mechanism. The current policy has been in place since 2012, and we're actually commissioning several studies. One is a review of existing implementation and lessons learned. A second, we're looking at the cost benefits. And then thirdly, we'll be looking at a range of topics, including more on implementation experiences and also emerging issues for accountability. That will then feed into potentially an update of the policy. That update would also be synergized so that we get the update of the safeguard policy done first, and then reflecting on that, we then might go into consideration of updates that need to be made for the accountability mechanism. So yeah, any suggestions and recommendations into that process are welcome. And we will be setting up a separate stakeholder engagement process for that. So stay tuned in the future for that process. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Irfan. Thank you, Bruce, for that. So we also have Ali Sibtain. It's got the hand raised for some time. So Ali, can I turn to you now? If you'd like to jump in, the floor is yours. You can never quite tell whether it's the mute button.
Hi.
There we go. Hello, Ali. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Duncan. I just had a follow-up question in regards to the comments that Irfan made. In regards to the gaps that are in the implementation of PPPs, just looking at the presentation that we were given on page 13, it mentions that the scope of the ESMS should be proportionate to the risk as identified through the risk classification process. Now, it is my understanding that the ESMS in a normal execution for a project is for a specific project, not like an FI kind of arrangement. And for an FI kind of arrangement, you have a framework, ESMF rather. Now, in our case, we are looking at multiple projects within the span of PPPs, and each has its own risk. When I look at this particular point for the ESMS, so ideally, I think we should be making ESMS document for each sub project. And in case if we are to do that, then how does the risk classification process come in to assess those individual projects? That's my question. And I hope this question is clear.
Thank you, Ali. That's a very good question. So we have a couple of colleagues here from our team covering both the private sector side and also sovereign. So perhaps Felix, you can jump in first, and we can add. Other colleagues can add if there's additional feedback to provide. So Felix, over to you.
Yep. Thank you very much, Duncan, and thanks, Ali, for that comments there. I would start with your first statement. I think the observation you made on slide 13, which is that the ESMS for projects should be proportionate or should be commensurate to the project's environmental, potential environmental and social risks. And that's correct. That is very much in line with the risk-based approach that we're going to be proposing under the new framework. That said, maybe I want to give a little bit of background to what an ESMS is as a safeguards instrument, and then we can come to that. So the ESMS, which is the Environmental Social Management System in itself, does not address the risk. It gives you the mechanism, or what I'll call systems and procedures, which are underpinned by an organization's capacity and commitment to address the risks. So ADB, in that instance, we're devolving our responsibility of due diligence, categorizing project to the intermediary in that sense. And what we do is, as of the time of due diligence, we're looking at the existing portfolio of that entity, the FI or any other entity, and looking at what the planned or future portfolio is going to be like. And then based upon that, you can assess what the potential risks are. It's at that point that we categorize that intermediary, right, based upon the portfolio. And then you set up a bunch of systems and procedures. But systems and procedures in itself are not that effective without a very strong organizational capacity and commitment to implement them, right? The best of systems and procedures that you write without a strong organizational capacity and commitment are very ineffective. And that's what the ESMS is meant to serve. So when projects is approved, sub-loans or sub-investment activities that ADB proceeds are meant to be used on would then, the intermediary would then have to perform the role of ADB by undertaking the due diligence of those sub-loans. But we've already had a heads up on what that future portfolio or what existing portfolio is, and that sort of addresses the ESMS. So the ESMS, in line with the risk-based approach, would always have to be commensurate or proportionate with the environmental and social risk of the project or the portfolio, what planned future portfolio has been mentioned. and you touch on ESMF, which on the sovereign side is the framework approach. In many cases, I think Bruce explained it quite well in one of his responses. Many cases you could explain that is quite synonymous to the ESMS in that there's upfront on what the ensuing project activities and components are. And then you can then assess the risk based upon that. You could put in mechanism tools, screening tools, organizational capacity arrangement to how to screen, assess, plan and monitor and report on. So in itself, it's also a framework, and I think predominantly used by sovereign. Hopefully that sort of addresses your question on the two safeguards instruments.
Yeah, Felix, thank you so much for that clarification.
You're welcome.
Thanks for that, Felix. Very helpful feedback, and I think useful for everybody on the call as well, for a bit of context. So the next question we have is, we've sort of touched on it a little bit, but perhaps if Bruce, you might like to come in a little bit again. This is just related to its grievance redress mechanism, but I think really this is, we're talking about, it's saying, the question is from Sharish Ashraf from Pakistan, is asking whether this is being reviewed and updated in the refined version of the SPS. So I think it may be the case that Sarish is actually asking about the accountability mechanism, but I think perhaps you can tackle it in line with what we're doing within the policy, as well as where we're going with the review with the accountability mechanism. I think you've already done that, but it just might be good just to touch on that again slightly. If I can turn to you, Bruce. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Duncan. Yeah, good question. So the new policy under the standard on stakeholder engagement, grievance redress mechanism, and information disclosure, that's going to be standard 9 in the new framework. So that we'll look at providing some further clarity on what's necessary for grievance redress mechanisms. I don't think, though, really at a policy level, we're really changing fundamentally what's required. Projects need to have appropriate grievance redress mechanisms based on, the scale of the project and how people are going to be affected. We will be, though, providing a bit more clarity that in certain cases, you may need to customize the grievance redress mechanisms to different needs. For example, we're increasingly seeing some incidents and some project grievances around sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. And they're very sensitive cases. And grievance redress mechanisms do need to think about how they could deal with such cases in a way that's sensitive to the people that have been impacted, the survivors of such cases. So there are some specific provisions that we're looking to cover those nuances. But I think for grievance redress mechanisms, what we've been learning is it's really about how do you customize them to the project? How do you make them more functional? And that goes well beyond projects. It's really about setting them up in the right way, having the right trained staff and skills, and providing capacity support. And that's something that we're keen to do. We've been working in several countries to do a lot more capacity building. Georgia, for example, we've done a lot of work on establishing good practice GRMs. So we're looking to how we can learn from that and support in other projects. Going back to the accountability mechanism. So I think this whole kind of cascade between projects having an effective grievance redress mechanism as sort of the first line where affected people can go for recourse. And really, we'd like to deal with it there. Or if people haven't been able to get a satisfactory resolution, there might be a place for ADB to, work in and support clients, borrowers such as yourselves, and people that might be affected to try and problem solve through those issues. But try them, head them off, because once it ends up in accountability mechanism, it can be a long and lengthy process to come to resolution. So better for us to put effort into dealing with them at the project level, and that's why we want to invest in capacity building there. So Duncan, I'll stop there and pass back.
Thank you, Bruce. That was very helpful, I think, and I think those are very good questions, and I think good to tackle them today. So the next question we have is from Camillus from the Water Resources Department in India. This one is to do with compensation. Is it possible to recommend by the ADB the minimum compensation to the project affected people for different developing member countries as a baseline data which shall not be reduced at any cost for all the modalities? So Felix, this one sounds like it should be for you. So over to you.
Thank you for being generous, Duncan. Yeah, I mean, this is a good point, but what's the name? Yeah, Camillus, I would probably maybe, if you look at the current SPS, it already raises the bar very high. And I understand where you come in there by creating a minimum compensation for project affected for different DMCs. It would be very nice to create a threshold and we say everybody, like the way we have the minimum wage globally, no less than a $2 or $1. But that is going to be quite a difficult undertaking, given that assets and how we value assets are based on various factors which are different from DMC to DMC. Rather, what has been in the SR2 safeguard requirement 2, which will be taken forward in the new ESS 5, will be the replacement principle. And I think that is the consistency. The principle is what we have to maintain, and that principle will be maintained across different DMCs. That principle would then ensure that the differences within the valuation mechanisms, how real estate markets are active, and various components that goes into valuing assets within DMCs are quite harmonized. So that is the approach that will be taken forward in the new land acquisition and involuntary settlement policy. What we should be aspiring, and you see that broadly in the objective of the new safeguard framework on land acquisition, has to do with not staying at that minimal level of doing no harm, but doing good. Doing good means that we should look to bring people's displacement. People that are receptive should have a better outcome of life than they were before project land acquisition happened, and especially when it comes into livelihoods. We should look at improving people's livelihood rather than just restoring people's livelihood. I hope maybe that sort of clarify your question on the data. The principle will be maintained to account for the differences within the DMCs in how you value assets. Okay.
Thank you for that, Felix. That's helpful response there. So I'm conscious of time. We've sort of run over now. So I'm going to ask one question from Ami Barry, and then after that I'll go for one further round of questions, and then I think we'll wrap up from there. So the question for Ami is to do with ADB's safeguard policy related to financial intermediaries. So in this case, the borrower enters the project as a lender in a very late stage when the environmental documentation such as the DPR, EIA, etc. have already been conducted as per the applicability of national guidelines, as well as land acquisition, resettlement and rehabilitation, etc. So what would be the roadmap to address this gap and ensure smoother transaction between ADB and the borrower? I think this already exists, this type of issue. So I think we've got good experience of how we can answer that. Mark, maybe I can turn over to you in this context with your experience with FIs.
Yeah, thanks, Duncan, and good afternoon, Ami. This is an issue that we often face in private sector because we're often coming into the deal cycle very late in the day, and as you've pointed out in your case, quite often a lot of the assessment documentation has already been prepared, land acquisition has been undertaken, etc., etc. In the event that this is a fairly large project and that there are a number of fairly significant issues, the only roadmap to address this is that we do have to audit existing work and identify any significant gaps, and then introduce measures to be able to fill those gaps, whether that's increasing compensation or doing supplementary work for an assessment document. And it's pretty painful process, I must admit, which is probably the reason why our financial intermediaries in the private sector, very few of them do category A projects with us. The majority of our FI portfolio is limited to category B projects, and the majority of them do mainly category C projects. So while this is a very difficult problem to deal with, it's not one that occurs too often in private sector, fortunately. I'm going to bring Bruce in at this point to provide a sovereign perspective on this.
Thanks, Mark. I think you've covered it pretty well, actually, because the challenge is very similar. And I think, in the case with IIFCL, as a financial intermediary loan from the ADB, you do have a fairly wide scope. And if I understand correctly, you can have category A projects there. So ones that could potentially have significant adverse impacts and risks. Now, if the due diligence process has really advanced and assessments been completed and approvals are already in place, as Mark said, really the best approach then is to look and have some audit and to do an assessment of whether there's potential to address any gaps. Beyond that, you also need to assess, well, what would be the risk of coming into a transaction like that at a very late stage? Are there really significant issues that the project design has advanced too far, and you wouldn't be able to address that to really meet your own requirements in your environmental and social management system or the requirements of a lender like ADB? In that case, it's a challenging issue where sometimes there might be some transactions that may not be able to be supported. But ideally, an audit, a gap analysis, and then an action plan agreed with the final borrower could be used. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that, Bruce and Mark. So we are over time. Maybe I can just open the floor if anybody has got any last questions, or we will turn it over to for a wrap up. So this is your last chance, folks. If anybody wants to jump in and ask a dying question you have, feel free, or I will turn it over to Gelson. Shazad, please go ahead.
Yes, I have a suggestion that in all the sessions like this one and other training sessions being conducted by ADB from time to time, I must suggest you that please invite relevant persons from especially from the project management unit and implementation unit of various projects of ongoing or any project in pipeline, because they are the one who are directly related with all these policies and who are the true implementer or compliant bodies who will be responsible to answer. Because I've noticed that in various trainings, there are some irrelevant, or you may say less relevant personnel are there instead of the persons from the project implementation unit, the line agencies, the project management unit, and all these the executing authorities. So I must recommend that please consider this aspect in all sort of practical training and consultative sessions like this one in future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shazad. I think probably Gelson can respond to that and wrap up at the same time. So perhaps I'll turn over to you, Gelson. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan, and for your smooth moderation, and a huge appreciation too from our participants for your very well thought out comments and also your suggestion on other relevant actors that we should invite for consultations like this. Please note that these are all captured in our documentation and will be used by ADB as the W paper is being drafted. Please stay with us for another 3 to 5 minutes because we will now move from a very substantive discussion to hearing your feedback on the process, which is now being flashed on your screen. So please rate your satisfaction with today's session. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 being the highest, meaning highly satisfied. We really need this because we want to keep improving the way we manage consultation in order to be meaningful, and especially as we will be preparing for our phase 3 consultations in the coming months. There's also a link to Menti wherein you can provide your specific feedback on how we can improve the consultation process. Can we see if we already have the response to the poll? And while the results of the poll will soon be flashed, we will now call Mr. Bruce Dunn to give us a wrap of what we have heard from this consultation and to give us an overview of what to expect after this last set of regional consultation. So Bruce, can I have the floor back to you? Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Gelson. Really appreciate everyone joining tonight. We did have about 100 people on the call, of which I think about 65 were from mostly government ministries, departments, and agencies. We did have some representatives from our executing and implementing agencies. I wanted to note also to Shahzad, your comment about the invitations. We actually do try and have broad but also focused invitations for these. We put information out through our website, but we also do work through the partner agencies of ADB to send out invitations to a very broad range of stakeholders that actually are clients of ADB and work closely together. But of course, you know, the timing of this will not necessarily suit everyone and not everyone's available. But we've had actually a lot of broad participation in these consultations. So far, more than 3,000 participants. So it's not necessarily covered in one consultation, but we do a number of sessions, so we have other people involved. Today, though, we have had a pretty broad conversation. This session was intended to focus on the different financing modalities, and we have had questions around a number of different finance modalities, but also a range of other questions, which I won't try to repeat all of the details, but you know, there were points raised, for example, around involuntary resettlement and some of the challenges of doing land valuation. We've had recommendations on climate change. We've had points raised about pesticides, grievance redress mechanisms, consultation processes, you know, all of these types of technical issues, which are, you know, all well noted and useful. But coming to what was really the key focus for today, we did also have a number of questions on the modalities and some recommendations on those. And I'll focus a little bit more on some of those topics. For example, around multi-tranche financing facilities and sector loans, and how we can enhance processes for those, the use of frameworks and when they're appropriate, also the financing period for MFFs. There were some of the topics covered. We had some clarifications on results-based lending, which not necessarily everyone here would be as familiar with. It's a different type of approach in the way that financing is channeled and the way we also manage the safeguards. It's a little bit more like a country system type approach, but applied for a specific program. We had quite a bit of discussion around financial intermediaries, and we had representatives from several projects that ADB's financing, such as the work on viability gap financing in Pakistan with a PPP type of an approach there, and also the IISCL in India, the Indian Infrastructure Financing Program there. And some questions around how would we apply the safeguards in different contexts. So for PPPs and also special project vehicles, and also for some of the FI transactions, this challenge around when you come into projects at a late stage, how can you manage and deal with those? Plus, we also had some questions around monitoring and how can those processes be enhanced. And we got into issues around accountability mechanism and the challenges with that. And I think there were some recommendations that can feed into the upcoming review of the accountability mechanism. But we've covered a lot of ground. And at this point, I wanted to change now to say, well, how do these consultations influence the process and what are we doing next? And first thing is, we have these consultations. We're actually running 5 consultations on this same topic. We'll be gathering the different views and recommendations. We'll make summaries of these consultations, and we will feed any recommendations into the drafting of the policy. And that's an ongoing process at the moment. As I mentioned earlier, the next step is then we're aiming to have a draft of the policy available to share publicly in the next couple of months. We're targeting at the moment by the end of April or May this year. And then after that, we will go to ADB's board for a discussion on the draft, but then we will go back out to stakeholders. We will share the draft policy with you, and we will then have further consultations before we try to finalize that early next year and take it back to our board. So that's the process. And the last thing that I wanted to mention also is a question that's been coming up quite a few times, is when would the new policy become effective? And what we're aiming to do there is after it's approved by our board, and again, the target for that would be early next year. So let's say the first quarter of 2024, the new policy would then become effective 12 months later, 1 year later. So that would be at the beginning of 2025. And it would then apply to projects going for approval by the ADB at the concept stage. And that's important because it allows new projects coming through at the concept stage to already plan for the new policy and to provide capacity support to the agencies that we work with. That also means that the new policy will not apply to any project that's already approved before that date. And it's not going to be grandfathered in any way to those existing projects. They will continue to follow the existing safeguard policy statement. So just wanted to make that clear. But again, look, thank you very much for everyone for joining this consultation today. We really appreciate and value your time, and we'll look forward to having further consultations with you in the future. Okay, thank you again and take care.
Thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you very much. Thank you.